Imagine a world without books, where history lived in songs and stories passed down from one generation to the next. Imagine people who built grand forts on hills, created breathtaking art from gold and bronze, and lived lives deeply connected to the land. These were the ancient Celts. They weren't a single nation with one king, but many different groups speaking related languages spreading across Europe from Ireland to Turkey, from the Atlantic coasts to the heart of the continent. Their influence was vast. In the Iron Age, they were a dominant force. We see their fingerprints everywhere, in place names, in the stunning Latene artwork, in tales of legendary heroes. Yet, for all their power and artistry, so much about them remains a profound mystery. We have Roman writers like Julius Caesar, but he was conquering them, so his accounts aren't always neutral. We have what archaeologists dig up, fragments of pots, pieces of jewelry, burial sites. But these only tell part of the story. It's like looking at a magnificent tapestry where most of the threads are missing. We can guess at the patterns, but the full picture is elusive. What did they truly believe about life and death? What powers did their mysterious druids wield? Why did they create such complex symbols, and what did they mean? And what happened to so much of their wisdom? These questions aren't just academic puzzles. They touch on the very core of human history, on how societies work, how knowledge is preserved, and what happens when cultures clash. We are still piecing together their world, trying to understand the people who shaped so much of early Europe, yet left us with so many unanswered questions. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if we've got it all wrong? What if the real Celts were far more complex, or perhaps even simpler than we can imagine? There are 19 big mysteries that still keep scholars up at night, things we just don't fully get. We're number 19. Who were the Celts, really? People often talk about the Celts as if they were one unified group, like the Romans or the Egyptians, but that's probably not quite right. It's one of the biggest mysteries right at the start. Were they a single ethnic group, a language group, or just a cultural style that spread across Europe? For a long time, historians and archaeologists thought of them as a distinct people, originating somewhere in Central Europe, maybe around the Hallstatt culture in Austria, around 800 to 450 BC. Then, later, came the Latene culture, which spread out from places like Switzerland and France. People really took hold in the 18th century, with scholars like Edward Llewellyn in Britain connecting the languages of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. He saw common threads, but the archaeological evidence, like the famous Latene art style, shows that these cultural markers were found over a huge area, from Britain and Ireland all the way to Hungary and even Turkey, where the Galatians lived. And Julius Caesar in his Gallic Wars wrote about the Celtic Gauls in central France, but he also knew of different tribes with different names. He didn't say everyone across Europe was a Celt. Modern research, like the work of Professor Barry Cunliffe from Oxford University, suggests a more complex picture. He talks about a Celtic fringe in the West Ireland, Britain, and a Celtic heartland in Central Europe. But he also argues that the idea of a single Celt is too simple. It might have been a shared language family, Proto-Celtic, that spread, and with it certain cultural practices and art styles. But the people themselves would have been diverse. Think about it like Europeans today. We share some broad cultural traits, but a Swede is very different from a Greek. It was likely the same for the ancient Celts. Some scholars, like Professor Simon James, argue that Celtic might be more of a modern invention, a way to group cultures with shared linguistic and artistic traits, rather than a self-identified single ethnicity in ancient times. The people themselves would have identified more with their tribe, the Arverni, the Iceni, the Brigantes. They probably didn't sit around saying, "We are all Celts." The DNA evidence is also complicated. There isn't a single Celtic gene that shows up everywhere. People moved, traded, intermarried. It was a fluid world. So when we talk about the Celts, are we talking about the people who spoke a certain kind of language, or those who created a specific kind of art, or those who shared certain religious ideas? It's probably all of these things, but not as a single monolithic identity. It's more like a network of related cultures, languages, and artistic expressions that blossomed across Iron Age Europe. What really defined who was a Celt to them? Did they even use that term for themselves universally? How much of our understanding is based on Roman writers trying to categorize their enemies? And does it even matter if they didn't see themselves as one people, if their cultural impact was so unified? Number 18, why so few written records? This is one of the most frustrating aspects of studying the ancient Celts. For a culture so widespread and influential, they left behind surprisingly few written records of their own. Most of what we know about them comes from what their Roman and Greek neighbors wrote or from archaeology. This is a huge mystery, especially when you compare them to the literate societies like the Romans, who wrote everything down. When we do find Celtic writing, it's often very limited. There are inscriptions, sometimes on stones or metal, usually names, dedications to gods, or property markers. An important example is the Coligny calendar, found in France, which is a bronze tablet detailing a complex lunar solar calendar. But even this is more a practical record than a historical account or a literary text. Other short inscriptions are found in various Celtic languages, often using Greek or Roman alphabets, like those from Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy. But there are no epic poems, no histories, no law codes written by the Celts themselves before the Christianization of Ireland and Britain centuries later. Roman writers, particularly Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic War, talk about the Druids, the Celtic priestly class. Caesar specifically states that the Druids committed a great many verses to memory, sometimes taking 20 years to learn their entire lore. He says they thought it wasn't right to commit these to writing for two reasons. They didn't want their teachings to become common knowledge among the general populace, and they believed writing would make people less diligent in memorizing. Other classical authors like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo also mention the oral tradition and the Druids' aversion to writing down their sacred knowledge. This emphasis on oral tradition is crucial. It means their history, their myths, their laws, their religious practices were all passed down by word of mouth. While this makes their culture vibrant and adaptable, it also makes it incredibly vulnerable. When communities were disrupted, when Druids were killed or suppressed, that knowledge could be lost forever. The Roman conquest brought immense pressure on Celtic cultures, and with it the potential for vast amounts of oral history to vanish. Think about the Irish sagas like the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the Cattle Raid of Cooley. These stories were eventually written down, but only centuries later by Christian monks, long after the height of Celtic paganism. How much did they change? How much was forgotten? How much was adapted to fit a new worldview? We can't know for sure. So, was it a deliberate choice by the Druids to keep knowledge sacred and secret? And was it a cultural preference for spoken word over written? Or did they simply not develop a sophisticated writing system for literary purposes, even if they used Greek or Latin letters for simpler inscriptions? We are left with tantalizing glimpses, but no direct voices from the ancient Celts themselves about their inner thoughts or grand narratives. It leaves us with a huge gap in understanding. Why did such a sophisticated culture resist written records when their neighbors did not? Did they have secret writings we just haven't found yet? And what incredible stories and knowledge are lost to us forever because they were never etched in stone or parchment? Number 17. The true power and practices of the Druids. The Druids are probably the most mysterious and captivating figures in Celtic history. They were the religious leaders, legal experts, teachers, and sometimes even political advisors. But what exactly did they do, and how much power did they really have? Most of our information about Druids comes from Roman writers, especially Julius Caesar, who encountered them in Gaul during his conquests. And Caesar had an agenda. He wanted to portray the Gauls as powerful but ultimately conquerable, and their priests as influential but also a source of fear. Caesar describes Druids as holding immense authority. He says they judged disputes, handed down sentences, and could even excommunicate people, which meant cutting them off from religious rites and social life. He claimed they were exempt from military service and taxes, which made many young men eager to join their ranks. And Druids also educated the youth, teaching them natural philosophy, astronomy, and theology. As mentioned before, they learned vast amounts of lore by heart, never writing it down. But Caesar also painted a grim picture of their rituals. He famously described them as performing human sacrifices, sometimes burning victims alive in giant wicker effigies. Other Roman writers like Diodorus Siculus also mentioned human sacrifice, including the use of omens from examining the entrails of sacrificial victims. These accounts are shocking and have heavily influenced how we see Druids. Archaeology provides some clues, but it's hard to definitively link specific findings to Druidic practices. Bog bodies like Lindau Man found in a peat bog in Cheshire, England, show signs of a violent ritualistic death, hit on the head, garroted, and throat cut. These could be examples of human sacrifice, perhaps carried out by druids, but it's hard to prove. Other sites, like sacred groves or wells, show evidence of offerings, sometimes valuable items or even animals. But these don't confirm the widespread human sacrifice Caesar described. Professor Miranda Aldhouse Green, an expert on Celtic religion, has explored the nuances of Druidic practices. She suggests that while ritual violence may have occurred, the extent and nature of it were likely exaggerated by Roman authors, who wanted to justify their conquests by showing the barbarity of the Celts. The Romans themselves practiced forms of capital punishment and gladiatorial games, so their moral outrage might have been selective. What was the extent of their knowledge? Did they really understand astronomy well enough to create calendars like the Coleni calendar? Did they truly have a sophisticated philosophy, or was it a form of animistic worship of nature gods? The fact that they controlled so much learning without writing it down suggests a highly organized intellectual tradition. They were the keepers of the collective memory and spiritual guidance. So, were they wise teachers and judges, guardians of ancient knowledge? Or were they bloodthirsty priests overseeing gruesome sacrifices? The truth is probably somewhere in between and far more complex than Roman propaganda allows. We don't have their own voice to tell us what exact role did the Druids play in Celtic society beyond what Romans told us. How much of their spiritual knowledge was lost, and how much was incorporated into later Christian beliefs? And if human sacrifice was real, was it a rare, extreme ritual or a common practice? Number 16, the purpose and meaning of bog bodies. Bog bodies are one of the most chilling and fascinating discoveries from the Iron Age, and they tie directly into the mysteries of Celtic ritual and belief. These are incredibly well-preserved human remains found in peat bogs across northern Europe, including areas where Celts lived, particularly in Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Britain. What makes them so mysterious is not just their preservation, but the often violent and ritualistic nature of their deaths. The peat bogs are natural marvels for preservation. The acidic, cold, and oxygen-depleted environment, along with sphagnum moss, which acts as a natural embalming agent, stops decay. This means hair, skin, clothes, and even internal organs can be incredibly well preserved, sometimes for thousands of years. The most famous examples linked to Celtic lands include Lindau man from England, Toland man, and Graubaul man from Denmark, and Gallig man from Ireland. Lindau man, discovered in 1984, is a prime example. Analysis showed he was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, who suffered a brutal end. He was hit twice on the head, had a garrote tightened around his neck until his spine broke, and his throat was cut. He also had mistletoe pollen in his stomach, suggesting he ingested it shortly before his death. This combination of injuries, known as a triple death, has led many archaeologists like Anne Ross and Don Robbins to suggest it was a ritual sacrifice, perhaps to multiple gods, one for each method of killing. The mistletoe also links to Druidic practices, as Pliny the Elder wrote about Druids venerating mistletoe. Toland man, found in 1950, was also a young man, naked except for a pointed leather cap and a leather belt. He had a rope around his neck indicating he was hanged. His peaceful expression has become iconic. And Graubaul man, found in 1952, had his throat cut from ear to ear. Many of these bog bodies show no signs of struggle, implying they might have accepted their fate, possibly as willing sacrifices. But why were they put in bogs? One theory, supported by scholars like P.V. Glob, who studied many Danish bog bodies, is that bogs were seen as liminal places, gateways between worlds, and thus suitable for offerings to deities. The gifts were not just objects, but human lives. Another theory is that they were criminals, executed and disposed of in a way that left them unburied, perhaps as a form of social ostracization or a warning. However, the nature of the deaths, often involving intricate methods and sometimes special preparations like Lindau man's last meal, suggests something more profound than simple execution. Some scholars, like Professor J.M. Coles, have questioned the extent to which these were always human sacrifices. They argue that some could have been accidents, or even individuals who committed suicide in bogs, though the evidence for violent ritualistic deaths is strong for many. The bog itself might have been a sacred landscape, a place where people interacted with powerful forces, and offerings, including humans, were part of maintaining balance or seeking favor. The bodies are a stark, silent testament to the darker side of ancient belief systems, forcing us to confront practices that shock modern sensibilities. They are direct windows into a world we barely understand, a world where the line between life and death, nature and spirit, was blurred. Were these people willing participants in their own deaths or victims? How common were such practices across Celtic lands? And what specific deities or beliefs justified such violent ritualistic endings in the bogs? For number 15, what did the Gundestrup Cauldron depict and mean? The Gundestrup Cauldron is an absolute masterpiece of Iron Age Celtic art, but also one of its greatest enigmas. Discovered in a peat bog in Denmark in 1891, it's a large silver vessel elaborately decorated with embossed scenes on its inner and outer plates. It dates to around 150 to 1 BC. What makes it so mysterious is its origin, its imagery, and its function. First, its origin. It was found in Denmark, but its style and iconography are clearly Celtic, and the silver itself likely comes from elsewhere, perhaps the Balkans. Some scholars, like Professor Garrett Olmsted, have argued it was made in Gaul, while others, like JVS Mega, suggest Thracian craftsmen, perhaps working for Celtic patrons, made it. The blend of Celtic, Germanic, and Near Eastern motifs is perplexing. It shows a vast cultural interchange across Europe in the late Iron Age. The imagery is where the real mystery lies. The cauldron depicts a dizzying array of figures, both human and animal, and various scenes that seem to be mythological or ritualistic. On the inner plates, we see a horned god, often identified as Cernunnos, the Celtic god of animals and the underworld, sitting cross-legged, surrounded by deer and other creatures. Another plate shows a goddess flanked by elephants, a clearly non-Celtic animal suggesting influences from the east. There's a scene of warriors, possibly a human sacrifice or initiation, with a large figure plunging a sword into a smaller figure, and dogs and wolves nearby. Another plate shows a wheel, often a solar symbol in Celtic iconography. The outer plates show busts of various deities, some with unique hairstyles or symbols, often surrounded by animals. One shows a god holding two wheels, another a goddess with intertwined snakes. The sheer complexity and apparent narrative of these images suggest a rich mythology, but without written texts, we can only guess at the stories they tell. What was its function? A cauldron has obvious uses for feasting and cooking, but this one is made of silver and so richly decorated that it seems unlikely it was an everyday pot. Most scholars believe it was used for ritual purposes. Perhaps it held a sacred drink like mead or ale, shared during ceremonies. Professor Miranda Aldhouse Green has suggested it might have been used in rituals involving transformations or offerings, given the themes of animal sacrifice, warriors, and deities. The fact it was found in a bog might indicate it was deliberately deposited as an offering itself. The images seem to tell a story about the Celtic pantheon, their beliefs about the natural world, death, and rebirth. But which specific myths are being shown? Why are elephants there? Why so many different gods and goddesses? It's like looking at a comic book with no captions and knowing that every panel is packed with meaning, but you don't know the language. The Gundestrup Cauldron is a tantalizing glimpse into Celtic cosmology, but one that leaves us with more questions than answers. What exact stories were the figures on the cauldron meant to convey? Was it made for a specific powerful leader or a community? And does its presence in Denmark suggest these beliefs were shared across vast distances, or was it a unique object traded far from its homeland? Number 14, the function and symbolism of Celtic knotwork in art. Celtic art, particularly the intricate knotwork and spiraling designs, is instantly recognizable and beautiful. But beyond its aesthetic appeal, what did it actually mean to the ancient Celts? This is a huge mystery because, like so much else, they left no instruction manual or philosophical treatise explaining their artistic choices. The most famous examples of Celtic art come from the Latene period, roughly 5th century BC to 1st century AD, which developed from the earlier Hallstatt culture. It's characterized by flowing, curvilinear lines, spirals, interlacing patterns, and stylized animal and sometimes human forms. Think of the Book of Kells or the Ardagh Chalice from early Christian Ireland, though these are later examples, they draw heavily on older Celtic traditions. Earlier pieces like the Battersea Shield or the Torques found at Snettisham in England show the skill and complexity even before the Roman period. Our archaeologist Lloyd Lang has studied these patterns extensively. He notes the prevalence of spirals, Driscoll's three-legged spirals, and knotwork that seems to have no beginning or end. This endless quality is often interpreted as symbolic of eternity, continuity, or the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. Many scholars, including George Bain, who did much to popularize the study of Celtic art, suggested that the complex knots were not just decorative, but deeply philosophical, representing the interconnectedness of all things. But was this interpretation present in the minds of the ancient Celts, or is it a modern overlay? Without their own words, it's hard to say. The patterns might also have had apotropaic functions, meaning they were meant to ward off evil or provide protection. The intricate details might have been seen as having magical power. Animal forms are also very common. Boars, stags, birds, and mythical creatures like dragons or griffin-like beasts appear frequently. These aren't just realistic depictions, they are highly stylized, often incorporating the same curvilinear patterns as the abstract designs. Did each animal represent a specific deity, a clan totem, or a particular virtue? For example, the boar is often associated with ferocity and spiritual power in Celtic mythology, while the stag represents the wild, the chase, and regeneration. But the precise meanings are debated. Human heads, sometimes disembodied, are also a recurring motif in Latene art. This might relate to the Celtic practice of headhunting, where the head was seen as the seat of the soul and power. But again, the exact symbolic weight of these depictions is not fully understood. The skill required to create this art, often on metalwork like bronze, gold, and silver, using techniques like repousse hammering from the back to create relief and enameling, shows a highly sophisticated craft tradition. The artists were not just artisans, they were likely contributing to the spiritual and social fabric of their communities. But their specific intentions, the stories behind their symbols, and the exact messages they intended to convey remain largely a matter of scholarly interpretation and educated guesswork. Did these designs carry specific secret meanings only known to certain people, like druids? Were they purely decorative, or did every curve and knot represent something profound? And how much of our modern understanding is projected onto an ancient culture we still struggle to comprehend? Number 13. The mystery of Celtic headhunting. Accounts from classical writers and archaeological evidence suggest that the ancient Celts practiced headhunting. This is a very grim and unsettling aspect of their culture, but it was also deeply significant, and its exact meaning and extent remain a mystery. Greek and Roman authors like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo described the Celts as taking the heads of their defeated enemies, often preserving them with cedar oil and displaying them prominently. Diodorus Siculus, in his Library of History, writes about the Gauls, saying they cut off the heads of their enemies slain in battle and attach them to the necks of their horses. He continues that they would then nail these heads to their houses, keeping them as trophies. He also mentions that they would preserve the most distinguished heads in cedar oil and boast about them, showing them off to visitors. This suggests not just a practice of taking trophies, but a ritualized veneration of the head. Archaeological discoveries support these accounts. At various Celtic sites, particularly hill forts like Entremont in southern France, a site of the Silurian Celts, evidence of head cults has been found. Their niches were carved into walls where human skulls were displayed. Some skulls even had holes drilled in them, perhaps for suspension. Similar findings have been made at other sites like Ribemont-sur-Ancre. These sites often show a mixture of human and animal remains, indicating a complex ritual context. Professor Miranda Aldhouse-Green has extensively studied Celtic beliefs about the head. She argues that for the Celts, the head was not just a body part, but the seat of the soul, identity, and spiritual power. By taking an enemy's head, a warrior was not just showing victory, but also capturing the power, courage, and essence of the defeated. It could be a way to absorb their strength or prevent their spirit from harming the victor. Displaying heads might have been a way to empower a community, protect a settlement, or serve as a warning to enemies. However, the specific rituals surrounding headhunting are largely unknown. Was it always done on the battlefield? Were certain types of heads preferred? Were the heads of kings or powerful warriors treated differently? How long were they kept? The Romans, of course, found this practice horrifying and used it to portray the Celts as savage barbarians, which served their propaganda. But from a Celtic perspective, it might have been a profound act, rooted in their cosmology. The human head also features prominently in Celtic art, sometimes as a disembodied motif, suggesting its symbolic importance went beyond just war trophies. The Irish myths, though written down much later, also contain echoes of the significance of heads, such as the tale of Bendigeid Fran's talking head in the Mabinogion. The practice of headhunting shows a deep belief in the power of the human head and a very different approach to death and the afterlife than we are used to. It's a challenging aspect to understand, forcing us to reconcile the artistic sophistication of the Celts with their seemingly brutal customs. What precise spiritual or magical power did Celts believe was contained in a severed head? Were these heads ever used in divination or other rituals? And how widespread was this practice across the vast array of Celtic tribes? And number 12. Why did they build massive hill forts? Across the Celtic lands of Iron Age Europe, from Britain to Central Europe, one of the most striking archaeological features is the vast number of hill forts. These monumental earthworks and timber palisades enclosed huge areas, often on strategic hilltops. But what was their primary purpose? Were they purely defensive strongholds, permanent settlements, centers of trade, or places of ritual and ceremony? It's likely they served multiple roles, and the emphasis varied from one site to another, making their exact function a continuing mystery. Some of the most impressive examples are in Britain, like Maiden Castle in Dorset or Danebury Hill Fort in Hampshire. Maiden Castle, for instance, has multiple elaborate ramparts and ditches covering an enormous area. Archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler excavated it in the 1930s and saw it primarily as a defensive settlement, a fortified town. Later work by Professor Barry Cunliffe at Danebury, excavated from the 1960s to the 1980s, offered a more nuanced view. Cunliffe's extensive research at Danebury showed that while it clearly had defensive capabilities, it was also a bustling community. It contained evidence of houses, granaries, workshops, and communal areas. It seems to have been a tribal capital, a focal point for the surrounding territory, where people lived, farmed, traded, and probably held assemblies. The huge defensive earthworks would have been an enormous undertaking, suggesting a well-organized society capable of mobilizing large workforces. But hill forts weren't just about defense and living. Many show signs of ritual activity. At Danebury, there were pits filled with deliberately broken artifacts, animal bones, and even human remains, suggesting offerings or ceremonial depositions. The entrances to hill forts, often very complex and winding, might have had symbolic as well as practical defensive significance, controlling access to a sacred or powerful space. Professor Richard Bradley has explored how landscapes themselves were imbued with meaning, and hill forts would have been prominent features within these symbolic geographies. The timing of hill fort construction is also interesting. Many were built and occupied during the Middle to Late Iron Age, a period of increasing social complexity and perhaps intertribal conflict. They might have been places of refuge in times of war, but also symbols of power and authority in times of peace. They were expensive to build and maintain, so they must have been central to tribal identity and survival. Some hill forts, especially in Central Europe, might have been more purely defensive or temporary refuges, while others, particularly in Britain, seem to have been occupied for generations as permanent settlements. The sheer variety in size, complexity, and internal layout of hill forts suggests there was no single blueprint or function. Each one evolved according to the needs and beliefs of its specific community. So, were they fortified villages, tribal centers, places of worship, or a combination of all three? How much of their design was practical, and how much was symbolic? And what were the precise political and social structures that allowed for the construction of such massive communal efforts? Number 11. The secrets of the Cluny calendar. The Cluny calendar is one of the most extraordinary Celtic artifacts ever found, and it's a huge clue to their sophisticated understanding of time and astronomy. But its exact workings and full implications are still hotly debated. Discovered in Coligny, France in 1897, it's a large bronze tablet, originally about 1.48 meters wide and 0.9 meters high, inscribed with a calendar in the Gaulish language using Latin letters. It dates to the 1st century AD, just before or during the Roman conquest of Gaul. The calendar tracks a 5-year cycle using both lunar and solar observations. It has 16 columns and is essentially an attempt to reconcile the lunar month, roughly 29.5 days, with the solar year, roughly 365.25 days. This is a complex astronomical problem that many ancient cultures grappled with. The Coligny calendar achieves this by adding an extra intercalary month every 2.5 years, a bit like our leap year, but designed to keep lunar months in sync with the solar year. Each month on the calendar is divided into two halves, with a mark for mat meaning good or lucky, and am meaning not good or unlucky for different days. This suggests that the calendar was not just for practical timekeeping, but also for religious purposes, perhaps guiding rituals, festivals, or agricultural activities. It likely told the Druids and the people which days were auspicious for certain actions. But the exact interpretation of some of its terms and its full function is still not completely understood. Scholars like Garrett Olmsted and Jean-Paul Savignac have spent decades trying to decipher its intricacies. For example, some months are marked as mide, which means intercalary or middle, but its placement and function are still debated. The language itself, Gaulish, is an ancient Celtic language, and while we can read the letters, understanding the specific vocabulary and grammatical structures can be challenging. The mere existence of such a sophisticated calendar completely undermines the Roman stereotype of the Celts as primitive barbarians. It shows a profound astronomical knowledge and a complex intellectual tradition, likely maintained by the Druids, who Caesar noted taught astronomy. The ability to track time over long cycles, balancing different celestial phenomena, indicates advanced observation and calculation. However, we don't know how widely this calendar system was used. Was it a regional calendar or part of a pan-Celtic system? Did other tribes have similar calendar tablets? What specific religious festivals or agricultural events were tied to these good and unlucky days? And how did they manage to make these complex astronomical calculations without advanced tools? The calendar is a silent testament to a hidden world of Celtic science and religion, but one whose full meaning remains just out of reach. What were the specific religious or social implications of good and unlucky days? Did the calendar guide specific Druidic rituals or community gatherings? And how did Celtic people actually use this calendar in their daily lives if it was largely interpreted by Druids? Number 10. The meaning of their unique burial practices. Burial practices are a window into a culture's beliefs about death and the afterlife. For the ancient Celts, their burials are incredibly varied and often perplexing, making it hard to form a single coherent picture of their beliefs. From rich princely graves to simple cremations and even a seeming lack of burials, the diversity is a big mystery. In the early Iron Age Hallstatt period, we find very elaborate princely burials in Central Europe. Sites like Hochdorf in Germany, excavated in the 1970s, revealed the grave of a Celtic chieftain from around 530 BC. He was buried in a wooden chamber with incredibly rich grave goods, a huge bronze cauldron similar to the Gundestrup, but much older, filled with mead, gold jewelry, weaponry, and even an entire chariot. He was laid on a bronze couch, wearing gold ornaments and fine clothing. This clearly indicates a belief in an afterlife where status and possessions were still important, perhaps a journey to the otherworld that required provisions. Chariot burials are a recurring theme, particularly in Britain, like the famous Wetwang Slack chariot burial in Yorkshire, excavated by Ian Stead. These graves often contained a dismantled chariot along with weapons and personal items. Did the chariot symbolize the deceased's status in life, or was it meant for a journey in the afterlife? Or both? The sheer effort and wealth invested in these burials suggest strong beliefs about the continuation of the individual beyond death. However, not all burials were so grand. Many common people would have had simpler graves, some cremations, others inhumations with minimal grave goods. And then there's the mystery of the missing burials. For certain periods and regions, particularly in parts of Britain, there's a puzzling lack of known burial sites for large segments of the population. Where did everyone go? Were they buried in ways that leave little archaeological trace, perhaps in unmarked graves? Or were some simply not buried at all, their bodies exposed or disposed of in other ways, like the bog bodies? Professor J.D. Hill, who has researched Iron Age burial practices in Britain, notes this phenomenon, suggesting that some communities might have practiced excarnation, leaving bodies exposed for scavengers or disposing of remains in ways that don't easily survive in the archaeological record, like scattering ashes or depositing bodies in water. This could reflect a different set of beliefs about the body's role after death, perhaps focusing on the spirit's release rather than the preservation of the physical form. The types of grave goods also tell a story. Weapons, tools, feasting equipment, and personal adornments suggest a material afterlife. The presence of food and drink, like the mead in the Hochdorf cauldron, hints at banquets or sustenance for the journey. but the lack of consistent patterns across all Celtic groups makes it hard to generalize. Did they believe in a specific underworld, a land of youth, or a cycle of reincarnation? Classical authors mention Druidic beliefs in the immortality of the soul and transmigration, but how that translated into burial rites is not clear. So why such diverse practices, from opulent burials to seemingly no burials at all? What did they truly believe happened to the soul after death? And what does the absence of certain types of graves tell us about the social structure and beliefs of those communities? Number 9, did they really fight naked? The image of Celtic warriors charging into battle, completely naked or wearing minimal attire, is a vivid one that comes from classical writers. But did they really do this? And if so, why? This is a mystery that blends practical considerations with spiritual beliefs. But Greek and Roman writers like Polybius, Livy, and Diodorus Siculus described Celtic warriors, particularly the Gesatai, a tribe of Gallic mercenaries fighting naked or nearly naked. Polybius, describing the Battle of Telamon in 225 BC, notes that some Gallic tribes, especially the Gesatai, fought stark naked. He states, this was done with a view to terrifying their opponents. Diodorus Siculus also mentions the Gauls sometimes going into battle naked, thinking that this displays their contempt for death. This nakedness would have been shocking and intimidating to the well-armored Roman legions. It might have been a deliberate psychological tactic, a display of extreme bravery, a contempt for death, or a way to connect with the divine. The idea of fighting naked suggests a warrior who trusts in his own skill, his gods, or perhaps has a magical protection that armor would only hinder. However, not all Celts fought naked, and probably not even all Gesatai did it all the time. Most Celtic warriors depicted in art or found in burials are shown with armor helmets, chainmail, and shields. Chainmail, in fact, might have been a Celtic invention, or at least they were early adopters and master craftsmen of it. So the image of universal naked combatants is likely an exaggeration or applies only to specific elite warriors or tribes. Why would some choose to fight naked? 1. Psychological warfare. The shock value alone would have been immense. It's a display of fearless defiance. 22. Ritual or religious significance. It might have been a way to invoke divine protection, to show contempt for death, or to participate in a sacred act. Being naked could have been seen as a more direct connection to the gods or the natural world, similar to some shamanistic practices. However, the lack of protection would have been a huge disadvantage against armored opponents. Archaeologist Peter Ellis, in his work on Celtic warfare, acknowledges the classical accounts but also emphasizes the material evidence of Celtic armor. The truth is probably that while the Celts were skilled metalworkers and used armor extensively, certain elite warriors in specific battles or rituals chose to fight naked for profound spiritual or psychological reasons. It was not the norm, but it was a memorable and impactful practice that stuck in the minds of their enemies. What specific spiritual beliefs underpinned the decision to fight naked? Was it an act of divine communion or a form of magical protection? And were there instances where this tactic proved successful against armored opponents? Number 8, the mystery of their advanced metalworking. The ancient Celts were truly master craftsmen, especially when it came to metalworking. Their ability to transform raw metals into intricate, beautiful, and functional objects is stunning, and the techniques they used, especially for the Latene style, are still a bit mysterious. How did they achieve such consistent quality and complex designs without modern tools? From the Hallstatt period onwards, around 800 BC, the Celts were skilled in iron production, which was a technological leap from bronze. They made effective iron weapons and tools, but it's in the Latene period from about 450 BC that their artistry in bronze, gold, and silver truly shines. This period is famous for its curvilinear, flowing designs, often featuring stylized animals, plants, and abstract patterns. Take, for example, the Battersea Shield found in the River Thames. It's a bronze shield richly decorated with red enamel and intricate swirling patterns. The Snettisham Torques, found in Norfolk, England, are massive neck rings made of twisted gold, sometimes weighing over a kilo, showcasing incredibly complex wirework and filigree. The Gundestrup Cauldron, as discussed, is another testament to their silverworking. The techniques they used were advanced for their time. They mastered 1, Ripu's hammering metal from the reverse side to create a raised design on the front. This required great skill and a detailed plan for the design. 2, chasing working the metal from the front with various punches and hammers to refine the repousse design or add detail. This was a complex chemical and physical process requiring precise temperature control. Archaeometallurgists have studied these artifacts to understand the processes. They found evidence of sophisticated workshops, specialized tools, and a deep understanding of metallurgy, alloying metals, and temperature control. For instance, the enamel on some pieces suggests temperatures in excess of 800 to 900 degrees Celsius, requiring advanced furnaces. The Celtic revival of the 19th and 20th centuries tried to replicate these techniques, and even with modern knowledge, it's a challenge. The consistency and quality across a vast geographic area suggests a shared tradition of craftsmanship, possibly passed down through apprenticeships and family lineages of artisans. These weren't just decorative objects, they were often symbols of status, power, and religious belief, imbued with meaning through their elaborate creation. But how did they share these complex techniques across such vast distances? Was there a school of Celtic art or master craftsmen who traveled? How did they manage the supply chain for precious metals like gold and tin, often found far from where the artifacts were made? And beyond the technical skill, what was the underlying artistic philosophy that drove such a distinctive and enduring style? How did Celtic smiths manage such precise temperature control for enameling and alloying without modern instruments? Were certain families or clans responsible for specific types of metalwork? And what training or apprenticeship systems allowed them to maintain such a high level of craftsmanship for centuries? Number 7. What was their relationship with the Otherworld? The ancient Celts clearly had a rich spiritual life, and a central part of this was their belief in an otherworld place, a supernatural realm that existed alongside, or perhaps interpenetrated their own. But the exact nature of this otherworld, and how people interacted with it, is full of mystery. Classical authors like Caesar mention the Druidic teaching of the immortality of the soul and reincarnation or transmigration of souls. This implies a destination for the soul after death, not just oblivion. Later Irish and Welsh myths, recorded much later by Christian scribes but drawing on older traditions, are full of stories of the otherworld. It's often depicted as a place of eternal youth, beauty, and abundance, where time works differently. It could be under hills, across the sea, or beyond a mist. It's a place of powerful beings, sometimes benevolent, sometimes dangerous. Professor Miranda Aldhouse Green, in her work on Celtic religion, often highlights the porous nature of the boundary between this world and the other world for the Celts. Places like sacred groves, springs, wells, rivers, and especially bogs were seen as liminal spaces, thresholds where the two worlds could meet. Offerings made at these sites, from valuable metalwork like the Gundestrup cauldron in a bog, or swords in rivers to bog butter, or even human bodies, suggest attempts to communicate with or appease the inhabitants of the other world. Gods and goddesses like the horn god Cernunnos or the Matres mother goddesses were often seen as chthonic earth-dwelling or connected to the natural world. They weren't distant Olympian figures, but intimately linked to specific places and forces. The tales of people being drawn into the Sithaferi mounds, often ancient burial mounds, or venturing into the sea to find magical islands, speak to this strong belief in a nearby, accessible, supernatural realm. The importance of divination, as mentioned by classical authors in relation to Druids, also points to a desire to understand and influence forces beyond the mundane. Consulting omens, interpreting bird calls, or examining entrails were ways to glimpse the will of the gods or the future, which were intrinsically linked to the otherworld. But what did they truly believe about it? Was it a single place or many different realms? Was it a heaven, a hell, or something else entirely? Did everyone go there, or only certain souls? The Christianization of Celtic lands undoubtedly changed and adapted these older beliefs. The fae folk and nature spirits of later folklore are surely echoes of these older pagan ideas about the inhabitants of the otherworld. Without their own written accounts or detailed theological texts, we rely on fragmented archaeological evidence and later myths. These give us a sense of a deeply spiritual people, who saw the world around them as alive with unseen forces and beings, and who sought to navigate and interact with these powerful realms. Did the Celts believe they could actively travel to the otherworld while alive, or only after death? How did their beliefs about the otherworld influence their daily decisions and moral code? And were there certain individuals, like the Druids, who had special access or ability to commune with this realm? Number 6, the role and power of Celtic women. Our understanding of the role of women in ancient Celtic society is largely filtered through Roman eyes, and their perspective might be biased. While Roman society was highly patriarchal, some accounts suggest Celtic women had considerably more status, rights, and power than their Roman counterparts. This disparity is a fascinating mystery. Classical writers offer conflicting but intriguing glimpses. Diodorus Siculus states that Gallic women were not only equal to their men in stature, but also in courage. Strabo recounts that among the Celts, women sometimes even went to war. The most famous example is Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni in Britain, who led a massive revolt against the Romans in AD 60 to 61. Tacitus describes her as a powerful figure, addressing her troops and inspiring them. We also know of Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes, who ruled in her own right and made treaties with the Romans, though she was eventually deposed. These warrior queens challenged the Roman norm. Archaeological evidence also suggests a higher status for some women. Rich burials, like those at Vix in France, a Hallstatt-era princess burial from c. 500 BC, contain incredibly valuable grave goods, including a massive bronze crater mixing bowl and elaborate gold jewelry. This suggests that women could hold significant wealth and status, possibly even ruling positions, independent of men. Other graves show women buried with symbols of authority or fine craftsmanship. And beyond queens and aristocrats, it seems Celtic women had more legal rights than Roman women. They could inherit property, own land, choose their husbands, and even initiate divorce. Early Irish law tracts, though written down much later, contain echoes of these rights, detailing specific ways women could hold property and claim independence. This is a stark contrast to Roman law, where women were always under the legal guardianship of a male. Women also seem to have played important roles in Celtic religion. Depictions of goddesses are common in Celtic art and iconography, such as the Matres or Epona, the horse goddess. Some scholars, like Professor Miranda Aldhouse-Green, argue that women may have served as priestesses or had significant roles in ritual. While Druids were mostly men in Caesar's accounts, there might have been female spiritual leaders whose roles were not recorded by Romans. However, we must be careful not to overstate their power. It was still a martial society, and male warriors often held the most visible positions of leadership. But the evidence suggests a much more egalitarian society than Rome, where women were not just confined to the domestic sphere. The specific legal frameworks, social norms, and religious roles that allowed for this varied power are still not fully understood. Did Celtic women truly have more equal standing in everyday life, or were powerful women an exception? Were there female druids, and what specific religious roles did women fulfill? And how much of the Roman portrayal of Celtic women as fierce and formidable was based on observation versus an attempt to exoticize or demonize their enemies? Number 5. How did Celtic languages spread and survive or not? The Celtic languages are one of the most defining features of Celtic culture, but their spread, diversification, and eventual decline or survival across Europe is a complex linguistic mystery. Today, only a handful of Celtic languages survive: Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. But in ancient times, Celtic languages were spoken across a vast swathe of Europe. Linguists divide the ancient Celtic languages into two main branches. One, continental Celtic languages like Gaulish, spoken in France, Celtiberian in parts of Spain, Lepontic in northern Italy, and Galatian in Anatolia, modern Turkey. All of these languages are now extinct. So too, insular Celtic languages of the British Isles, which further divide into Gaelic Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Manx, and Brittonic Welsh, Cornish, Breton. These are the languages that survived. The mystery begins with how these languages spread so widely. The traditional view links the spread of Celtic languages to the migration of people from a core area in Central Europe, Hallstatt and Latène cultures. As these people moved, they brought their language with them. However, more recent theories, like those proposed by archaeologist Colin Renfrew, suggest a different model: Elite dominance or wave of advance. Here, a language might spread through cultural diffusion, trade, or by an elite group imposing their language on existing populations rather than mass migration. Professor John Coach, a linguist, has also explored the complexities of this spread, often tying it to movements of specific warrior or trading groups. The sheer diversity within the Celtic language family is also puzzling. Why did they differentiate so much, yet retain clear family resemblances? The P-Celtic Brittonic and Q-Celtic Goidelic distinction is a classic example, referring to how a Proto-Celtic two-sound evolved, e.g. 5 is pemp in Welsh, but co-ig in Irish. This linguistic split must have happened early in their history or as they branched out. The decline of continental Celtic languages is largely attributed to Roman conquest and assimilation. When the Romans conquered Gaul, for instance, Latin became the language of administration, law, and education. Over centuries, Gaulish gradually faded, replaced by Vulgar Latin, which eventually evolved into French. The same happened in Spain and other Romanized areas. But why did insular Celtic languages survive in Britain and Ireland? Ireland was never conquered by the Romans, allowing Gaelic to flourish relatively untouched. In Britain, Brittonic languages like Welsh survived in the West, protected by geography and the persistence of local cultures even after Roman withdrawal and Anglo-Saxon invasions. The fact that Welsh, Irish, and Breton brought to Brittany from Britain by migrants are still spoken today is a testament to cultural resilience and specific historical circumstances. The questions remain: was there a single Proto-Celtic homeland, and where exactly was it? What were the precise mechanisms of language spread, conquest, trade, or a gradual cultural shift? And what specific social factors allowed the insular Celtic languages to resist the dominance of Roman and later Germanic languages for so long? The story of Celtic languages is a testament to cultural survival, but also a stark reminder of what can be lost. What level of mutual intelligibility existed between different Celtic languages in ancient times? Were there specific regions that acted as linguistic melting pots or points of origin for new dialect formations? And could we ever fully reconstruct Proto-Celtic to understand its true roots and evolution? Number 4, the extent of their trade networks. The ancient Celts are often depicted as fierce warriors, but archaeological evidence clearly shows they were also sophisticated traders with extensive networks stretching across Europe and beyond. The exact reach and complexity of these trade routes and the goods exchanged are still being pieced together, revealing a much more interconnected world than previously imagined. From the Hallstatt period around 800 to 450 BC onwards, we see evidence of long-distance trade. High-status burials like the Hockdorf chieftain's grave contain objects from distant lands. The massive bronze crater found there, capable of holding hundreds of liters of mead, was of Greek manufacture, likely from a workshop in southern Italy. This shows a direct link between Central European Celts and the Mediterranean world. What were they trading? 1. Raw materials. Celts had access to valuable resources. Iron ore was abundant in many Celtic lands, and they were experts at working it. They also controlled important sources of tin crucial for bronze production from places like Cornwall in Britain and amber from the Baltic Sea. These materials were highly sought after by Mediterranean civilizations. 2. Manufactured goods. Celtic metalwork, especially their elaborate weaponry, jewelry like torques and tools, would have been valuable trade items. Their textiles and pottery also show high quality. 3. Salt was a vital commodity for food preservation and health, and Celtic areas, particularly around Hallstatt in Austria, were important salt mining centers. In return, the Celts received luxury goods from the Mediterranean: fine pottery, wine, olive oil, bronze vessels, and possibly even ideas in artistic styles. The elephants on the Gundestrup cauldron suggest a connection, however indirect, to Eastern goods or imagery. The presence of Greek and Roman coins in Celtic hoards further confirms these trade links. The major trade routes followed rivers like the Danube, Rhine, and Rhone, allowing goods to move inland from coastal ports. Overland routes, though more arduous, connected different regions. The discovery of Celtic oppida, large fortified settlements along these routes, such as Bibracte in Gaul, suggests they acted as major trade hubs and manufacturing centers. Archaeologists like Barry Cunliffe have meticulously mapped these ancient routes, showing how interconnected Europe was long before the Roman Empire unified it. The sheer volume and variety of goods exchanged point to a sophisticated economic system, with merchants, established routes, and probably a certain degree of peace between different groups to allow trade to flourish. However, many questions remain. What was the exact role of Celtic merchants in these networks? Were they active participants in long-distance voyages, or did they mostly act as intermediaries, passing goods from one tribe to the next? How did they manage payment and valuation before the widespread adoption of coinage? And what impact did these external goods and contacts have on their own cultural development beyond just luxury items? The trade networks show a powerful and dynamic Celtic presence on the international stage of their time. What were the precise mechanisms of exchange and credit in these long-distance trade networks? Did specific tribal groups control particular trade routes or resources? And how did the influx of foreign goods and ideas affect the local economies and social structures of Celtic communities? Number 3, what did their animal symbolism truly represent? The animals feature prominently in ancient Celtic art and mythology, and they were clearly deeply meaningful. But what specific symbolic weight did each animal carry for the Celts? This is a rich area of mystery as we try to interpret their world through the eyes of a people who saw nature as sacred and alive. From the earliest examples of Celtic art, animals are not just realistically depicted, they are stylized, exaggerated, and often integrated into complex patterns. They appear on metalwork, carvings, and later in Christian manuscripts drawing on older traditions. The boar, stag, horse, bird, snake, and bull are among the most common sun runs. The boar. This is perhaps the most iconic Celtic animal. It often appears as a war standard or as a motif on weapons. The boar was a symbol of ferocity, courage, and spiritual power. It was a formidable opponent in the hunt, known for its aggression. In Irish mythology, boars often have magical properties or are associated with powerful figures. Professor Miranda Aldhouse Green has explored its role as a sacred animal, possibly linked to the underworld or a warrior deity. They might also represent the boundaries between the human and wild worlds. Horses were vital for transport, warfare, and agriculture. They symbolize speed, power, fertility, and potentially a connection to the other world. Horse burials are found, suggesting their special status for birds, especially waterfowl, were often depicted. They could represent freedom, communication with the heavens, or messengers between worlds. Different birds might have had specific meanings, perhaps linked to divination or specific deities. Their appearance on the Gundestrup cauldron suggests a profound spiritual role. The bull symbolized strength, virility, and abundance. The Timbo Qualanje cattle raid of Cooley in Irish myth highlights their central economic and symbolic importance. Beyond these individual meanings, the way animals were depicted often in abstract flowing forms that merged with other patterns suggests a holistic view of the natural world. Animals were not just creatures, they were manifestations of divine power, spiritual guides, or symbols of cosmic forces. The act of stylized representation itself might have been a way to capture and channel their power. However, the specific narrative meanings are often lost. Did a boar on a shield invoke a specific god or just a general sense of ferocity? Was an animal depicted because it was a totem for a tribe or a clan? Or was it part of a broader symbolic language understood by everyone? The subtle differences in regional art also suggest local variations in animal symbolism. So, while we can infer general meanings, the precise theological or mythological significance of each animal and how these symbols were used in daily life, ritual, or warfare remains largely interpretive. They are a powerful clue to a spiritual world deeply embedded in nature, but one we can only glimpse. Were there specific taboos or rituals associated with certain animals? Did individuals or tribes identify with particular animal totems for spiritual guidance or identity? And how did their animal symbolism influence their understanding of the natural world and their place within it? Number 2, the true purpose of sacred groves and water sites. The Celts were deeply connected to their natural environment, and for them, certain places in the landscape, especially groves of trees and sources of water, were not just geographical features but sacred sites imbued with divine power. The exact purpose of these places and the rituals performed there are a profound mystery, largely hidden from us. Classical writers, again, provide some clues. Tacitus in his Annals describes the Romans destroying sacred groves on Anglesey, a Druid stronghold, during their conquest of Britain. He talks about altars smoking with human sacrifice, suggesting the groves were places of dark ritual. Pliny the Elder mentions Druids cutting mistletoe from oak trees, indicating the oak's special sacred status. These accounts paint a picture of dense, untouched forests as centers of worship and ritual activity. Archaeology largely supports the idea that groves and bodies of water were focal points for religious practices. While no physical temples like those of the Romans exist, post holes or stone circles might mark areas where rituals took place. Offerings, sometimes valuable, might have been left at the base of trees or buried within the grove. These were seen as places where the gods resided, or where the boundary between this world and the other world was thin. They were seen as sources of life, healing, and spiritual power. Countless offerings have been found in rivers, lakes, and bogs across Celtic lands. These include weapons, tools, jewelry, coins, and even human remains. For example, the River Thames has yielded numerous Celtic artifacts, including the Battersea Shield and many swords. This was not accidental loss. These were deliberate depositions. The springs at Bath Aquae Sulis in Britain, even under Roman rule, remained a major center for offerings to the goddess Sulis Minerva, a fusion of a local Celtic deity and the Roman Minerva. Professor Miranda Aldhouse Green has explored these water cults extensively. She argues that water was seen as a purifying, healing, and life-giving force, a gateway to the other world. Offerings were made to specific water deities, or as part of rituals for fertility, healing, or divination. The act of consigning valuable objects to water was a powerful act of sacrifice, taking them out of human circulation and dedicating them to the gods. The rituals themselves are largely unknown. Were they individual acts of devotion or communal ceremonies led by druids? Did specific groves or springs have particular deities associated with them? The liminal nature of these places at the edge of the wilderness, or at the source of water, made them ideal for interacting with the supernatural. The enduring appeal of holy wells and sacred trees in later folklore and early Christian practices in Celtic lands further hints at the deep-rooted nature of these beliefs. Many Christian sites were built on or near older pagan sacred places, perhaps to absorb their spiritual power. So, what specific ceremonies took place in these sacred groves and at these water sites? Were the offerings meant to appease, communicate with, or simply honor the deities? And what role did the natural features themselves, the age of a tree, the flow of a spring play, and the spiritual significance of the site? Number 1. What happened to their lost knowledge after Roman conquest? This is perhaps the greatest and most tragic mystery of the ancient Celts. When the Roman Empire conquered vast swathes of Celtic Europe, particularly Gaul, Britain, and parts of Central Europe, what happened to the immense body of knowledge, history, and spiritual lore that was so carefully preserved by the Druids through oral tradition? The answer largely is that it was lost forever. The Roman conquest was not just military, it was a cultural and administrative takeover. Romanization meant the imposition of Roman law, Latin language, and Roman ways of life. For the Celts, this had a devastating impact on their oral culture, everyone. Suppression of Druids. Julius Caesar saw the Druids as a powerful and unifying force among the Gauls, and thus a threat to Roman rule. He systematically targeted and suppressed them. Tacitus records the brutal massacre of Druids on Anglesey, a major center of Druidic power in Britain. Without their primary custodians, the vast unwritten knowledge of the Celts was incredibly vulnerable. Roman conquest brought immense social disruption, warfare, displacement, and the breakdown of traditional tribal structures. This made it incredibly difficult for the Druidic colleges to continue their work. New generations were increasingly exposed to Roman education and the Latin language. This meant that once the oral tradition was broken, there was no backup. If a Druid died, their unique knowledge might die with them, unless a student had fully mastered it. Unlike the Egyptians or Greeks who had libraries and written archives, the Celts had no such recourse. This assimilation, whether forced or voluntary, led to the gradual fading of distinct Celtic pagan beliefs and practices. The old gods were often syncretized with Roman deities, e.g., Sulis Minerva, and the old stories were either forgotten or adapted beyond recognition. While Christian monks eventually wrote down some of the old myths, like the Irish sagas, they did so from a Christian perspective, often editing, adapting, or sanitizing stories to fit a new worldview. Much would have been deliberately excluded or changed. So, the knowledge of their complex astronomy as shown by the Collini calendar, their sophisticated philosophy as hinted at by Caesar, their intricate legal systems, and their rich pantheon of gods and goddesses all largely vanished. We are left with tantalizing fragments, Roman observations, archaeological finds, and much later, Christian-filtered myths. The loss is immeasurable. It means we can never truly hear the Celts' own voices regarding their deepest beliefs, their histories, or their understanding of the world. We can only interpret, infer, and imagine. It's a stark reminder of how fragile culture and knowledge can be, especially when it relies solely on the spoken word in the face of a conquering, literate power. What specific philosophical or scientific breakthroughs did the Druids possess that are now forever lost? Could any of this lost knowledge have influenced later European thought, even indirectly? And how much of the lost knowledge was simply absorbed and transformed into later folk traditions or Christian beliefs, just beyond our recognition?